Fellow tennis nerds, today I'm talking to a distinguished guest, Christopher Clarey. He's been on the podcast before. That was 2 years ago when he had published The Master, a brilliant book about Roger Federer. This time he's back to discuss another book. It's not called The Master, it's called The Warrior, and it's about Rafael Nadal. He is a best-selling author and long-time writer for the New York Times. Not anymore. He has his Substacks that you should subscribe to. It's a great newsletter where you get a lot of information about tennis. He's an excellent writer. But first of all, how are you today, Chris?
Hey, it's great to see you again. I'm doing fine. I'm in San Diego. Just played a little tennis this morning.
Oh, nice.
And I didn't meet Nadalian levels, unfortunately, but I did my best to whack the ball around. So it was good.
I think Nadal is one of the most inspirational tennis players and athletes maybe of all time. And I get that feeling when I read your book. Like it brings me back. I mean, it's obviously exceptionally well written, but it kind of brings me back to kind of strong nostalgic emotions of like how tennis used to be. Not saying it's a bad product today. Was that something you went through yourself, covering tennis so long that you felt that this strong nostalgia when you wrote this book?
Yeah, I mean, we have this recency bias, don't we? I mean, we end up having all these emotions in the present time, and we sort of remember last season and the season before. But the stuff that, when you have a career as long as Nadal or Federer or Djokovic or these players, the stuff at the beginning, it tends to get pretty blurry, and you tend to forget some of that. So that it was powerful when I wrote this book to go back and look through all my interviews and notes from 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, those early years, and having that time when Rafa was kind of becoming this global figure in sports, and trying to figure out his place in the tennis hierarchy with Federer and the players who were still there at the time. And so it was a lot to learn again. And I think going back and doing it, enough time has passed that sort of 20-year mark is a good mark to go back and look. As it turned out, that was sort of Rafa's big timeline was 2005, first French Open, and then he stopped in 2024. And so I felt like it was really, you knew it at the time, but it was one of the most special times in tennis history, for sure, to have these two great forces of very different playing styles colliding, and how appealing that they were as individuals and how they really connected with the public. And I think, I hope the book brings that out, because I really tried to go back, especially this 2005 season when Rafa had his breakthrough coming off the Davis Cup win in Sevilla against the Americans in 2004. And that whole year was just jam-packed with development and great matches.
Yeah, and it's very easy to forget kind of still recent histories 20 years ago, like the Coria, how dominant he was at that time, and Gaston Gaudio, when he came and kind of snatched the French Open, that brought me back, that time. And it was all these whispers about Rafa, like this force of nature almost, he's coming onto the scene. And even the players, which you read about it now in your book, and it's kind of funny, like I remember that as well. They were like, well, there's no point now. He's just too good. Already then he had shown such like dominance and charisma and like on the court as well. That people were already like folding before he had really done anything. Right. That was really fascinating, actually.
I mean, he had that early win in 2003 against Albert Costa at Monte Carlo, which was, I think, caught everybody's attention inside the tennis bubble, for sure. I think everybody knew the potential was there, but you had to see him do it. But I just remember Monte Carlo, he wins in 2005 on his way to greatness at the French Open, but he hasn't played the French Open yet. And Coria, who was, the guy, had been in the French Open final, and he'd been the best, most consistent clay courter for the last couple of years. He goes, I just lost to the best clay court player in the world. And this is before Rafa has started to compile all these amazing things. It's his first Monte Carlo. But Coria was already, I think, in his mind, stating the obvious. Yeah, they could feel it. Those players know it. You play, you know what it's like. So I think that, and people tend to describe Rafa, interestingly, you use that phrase, force of nature. People tend to describe him as a natural phenomenon a little bit, Even Federer in some of the interviews that I did, I mean, it's like he almost talks about him as if it's it, not he. It's like this thing that's sort of taking over, in that case, the clay, but ultimately many other things too.
And yeah, one of the things you talk about in the book a lot is his connection to the clay, right? Like, and that maybe makes him even more a force of nature, right? Because he's so connected to the surface. He's like a part of the surface, and the surface, kind of poetically in the book as well, becomes a part of you, because all the granules, all the particles are everywhere. You talk about the clay factory and stuff where they break the brick, and all the work that goes into just making that clay court as pristine. Like we're talking about the French Open, one of the best clay courts in the world, and you feel that. You feel like it's so all connected and it's kind of like meant to be. And that's kind of a nice sensation in retrospect to like being able to picture that very important part of tennis history.
Well, it's funny because I feel like it is a kind of a granular, tactile experience, writing about clay court tennis. And Rafa is, such a physical thing. And have you been to the tennis club Manacor? Have you played there? Or Rafa?
I've been there, but I haven't played on the courts. I've been to his academy, and I was around a little bit in Manacor as well. I will
Yeah.
do that more. I will go there again. That would be fun,
He
actually.
obviously has his big academies. That's where all the
Yeah,
focus is now. But one of the real interesting things is to go spend time at that place because, especially with me having this sort of clay court accented book that I have, and maybe we can talk about the reasons why I chose that. I don't mean to diminish Rafa as an overall player, but it just seemed like that was the element you wanted to get into. But I mean, you walk into this club. I don't know if it's been renovated in the last year, but when I was there, it's felt a bit trapped in time. There are yellowing newspaper clippings behind kind of faded glass, and it looks like things haven't changed, in some ways since the 70s or the 80s there. But what really strikes you is that the red dust and the clay, it's everywhere. It's kind of rubbed into the walls. It's on the walkways. It's part of the cement now. It's sort of sticking to the fence. All the drag nets have got it covered on them, and it's just there. It's just part of, I guess, like growing up in the Sahara, with sand, in your tent. It's just kind of the way it is, right? So I think that was a really wonderful image to have in mind writing the book. Just a sense that's where Tony was. Rafa's family lived right across the street early on. So it was literally across the street. You could walk over there, and these clay courts that were going to change the history of tennis. Really was right across the street, kind of like Djokovic with the hard courts across from the family pizzeria in Kapaunic and Jelena Gencic. It just happens to be there. Very close, very accessible. But that clay, yeah, I almost wish we could have found a way to have like some kind of sandpaper instead of pages in the book.
yeah,
The cover is great because I'll just show you the cover,
yeah. Do it.
you got the designers did a great job because they kind of put the clay inside the letters, and I think you can sort of feel the way it gets into everything, from the cover, which was neat.
Yeah, it looks great. It looks great.
Yeah, it was. I think the photographer is Antoine Couvercel. I don't know if you know his
Yep.
work.
Yeah, I know him.
He's a
Yeah.
wonderful, wonderful photographer, and he, like me, and maybe like you, I don't know. Maybe I got the chance to meet Rafa very young, and Antoine as well. Antoine went on a photo shoot to Manacor in 2004 when Rafa had just won the Davis Cup with Spain, and took pictures in his room, and those are in the book, and it was just a special window into. Obviously, that's not going to be happening later on in Rafa's career, but it was a moment. And so Antoine was a great choice to be the photographer for this cover and for this book.
Yeah, he has taken some iconic photos. Very impressive stuff. And it's interesting. We talk about the clay, and the clay is such a strong part of Rafa, but it seems like in his ways, almost like he doesn't want to be pigeonholed into that. Just I'm a clay court player. He wants to talk a lot about like I love grass. He was obviously a very good grass court player. His injuries, he talked about in an interview with Roddick, right? Like the injuries more of prevented him from like showing even more results, in Wimbledon. He couldn't play for many years and so on. So did you sense that as well? Like he didn't want to get pigeonholed or categorized as just a clay courter. He wanted to show that, okay, I can do any surface and I like all the surfaces, but then the clay is where he showed his true dominance. Right?
Absolutely right. No, and there are actually interviews from him when he's very young, when he's asked, which tournament do you want to win the most? And he says Wimbledon. And when he's 14, 15, 16 years old. So I guess it's not surprising in a way because, I mean, his first love and maybe still his greatest love is soccer. And that's played on grass. So it isn't like he was a grass is for cows kind of guy, like a Bruguera or some of the other players over time, or a Rios. I mean, he definitely connected with that natural surface as well. But his destiny was, clearly the clay, and that's what was most accessible to him. I know he played on hard courts quite a lot with Tony growing up. Cost him a bit to switch back and forth as much as he did for his body, as you would know. And he's talked about that over the years, how that was maybe a mistake looking back. But I mean, he is, and I hope this book in no way is taken as Rafa is a clay court specialist. he was a fantastic all-time champion who happened to be a clay court specialist. I mean, he was his own record, and I think this really is important to remember. Is he won 22 majors, 14 of them were the French Opens, but 8 of them were other surfaces, and he won each of the other ones at least twice. So 8 majors. You know who's in that same category? Maybe you know. Do you know
Yeah,
anybody on that who has 8?
but he did beat like Edberg, Agassi, and these guys, right?
Right, but eight majors. You notice is Lendl.
Yeah, Lendl,
That's
yeah.
how many he won total. Agassi,
Agassi was 8.
Connors,
Okay,
and Connors. Connors didn't play the Aussie Open much,
no.
but nonetheless, Agassi, Lendl, Connors won 8. So Rafa, without clay, won 8. So the guy is a Hall of Famer, even if he never put foot on clay.
Yeah, it's
So
insane.
you add the clay on, and it becomes something just extraordinary. And 8 is one more than McEnroe. So I mean, you just can't forget the guy was an all-court champion. It was very important to Rafa, I think, and also to Rafa's team and people like Benito Perez Barbadillo, his publicist who worked at the ATP. Benito was very sensitive to any suggestion that Rafa was a clay court specialist, and I understand why he was. I mean, he has a multi-surface champion who has an ability to reach all parts of the world with his ability, and a lot of clay courters until Rafa came along were often kind of consigned to a little category apart. And I think the concern that Rafa and his team had were that he didn't want to be in that category, and ultimately he really shouldn't be. But there's really, for me, no doubt, and I hope you agree. When we talk about Rafa 20 years from now, what are we going to think about? We're going to think about 14 French Opens and the clay, I think, unless something crazy happens and people are able to play and have 40-year careers because of biological advancements. I don't know, but from what I can tell, 14 is the number. It's going to be there, on the wall of history.
Yeah, and there's something with the surface of clay, like fitting him so well also as a person, right? Like the grit, the determination. I think also he's one of the best problem solvers. Like you talk about that in the book as well, like how he saw everything as a challenge. He was a little bit like stoic suffering that Tony instilled in him. Like you have to suffer. Suffer is a challenge. Challenge is good. That he learned really early, and I think that is if you ever play on clay, like people listening, it's like clay is a surface where you have to work harder. Like always, you have to grind longer. Points are longer. You're gonna get dirty if you fall over. You have to learn how to move with the surface. He was obviously amazing at sliding both directions, stuff that many players cannot learn, like in the same way that he had it naturally. So I think
Right.
it's just such a fitting, you see Rafa with like some dirt on like a white shirt or something. Yeah, you see the red in him, and I think that is the most poetic and kind of the most suitable picture with him. Like that surface works so well for his personality as well.
You're right. I think he's a multimedia artist, but his best canvas was clay.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. Absolutely. And I think Emilio Sanchez Vicario describes it in the book. He says it's the perfect storm. And it really was, because all these things came together, and all these things had to come together, considering who he's playing against, too. He's got Djokovic, who's a great clay courter, and Federer, who was also grew up on clay and played wonderfully on clay, just, even with his more attacking style, and the Vrinkas and Murray, who got good on it, and Del Potro, and just so many challenging players in this era. Maybe not quite as much depth on the surface as there might have been 25, 30 years ago, but high level. So what he achieved required a perfect storm. And I think the combination of his amazing physical abilities, his incredibly talented athlete, the sliding and technique that you describe, um, the forehand, which is an ultimate weapon on many surfaces, but really on the clay because of what it can do, and then the psychology and the mentality all coming together. And you need a little bit of luck. You need to make your own luck. But I just don't think all those elements would be so difficult to bring together again. And you highlighted, Jonas, very well. I think Tony Tony had a lot of help, more than I think I realized before I started to report this book in depth. I don't think I'd realized quite to what degree he was bringing other people into the mix, and it was a very wise decision on his part to do that, because he hadn't been to the top of the summit and hadn't built a player of that level. But he obviously deserves the lion's share of the credit. But his real genius was what you described, was that ability to develop from a very early age this mentality of, it's going to be hard, but we like hard, and you're going to love the fact that it's hard, and that's where the challenge and the beauty lies. And he was able to integrate that, I think, in Rafa's training and mentality from the very beginning. And obviously, then you got to have someone like Rafa who has the natural ability to accept that, not crack, bend but not break, and really embrace the ethos of it. So I think it might look kind of straightforward from the outside as he crushes everybody into red dust every year for 20 years almost, but it wasn't. It took a lot of things that had to come together for it to happen.
Yeah, and many injury scares and stuff. Like I remember talking about Rafa as like the guy who was gonna, blow out his career really early. I mean, I think most people did. He had these huge foot issues very early on, as you talk about in the book as well. And like he always had this kind of relationship with injuries, in his body aching and breaking, and you heard a lot about that. But he was such a gritty fighter, and that's also something you think about, like how many slams could he have won with being healthy and so on. But it doesn't really matter. You can always discuss in retrospect. But how important part of his career do you think, like the injury talk and the foot and all this stuff, was in Rafa's legacy?
Yeah, I think it was to some degree a double-edged sword. I do think for sure he would have certainly been better off not having chronic foot issues and all the knee pain that he had. I mean, I've seen diagrams of Rafa's injuries at the end of his career, and it's like they're arrows pointing to every part of the body, right? With a little bubble up there saying injured here. And so for sure, his style of play and the fact that the foot happens so early with the Muller-Weiss, and that creates all kinds of knock-on effects in your body as you compensate, which of course is part of the reason why the knees and other things started to suffer so much. That's all downside for sure. Uh, the upside is that I think he was mentally perhaps uniquely equipped to deal with this because of the way Tony created this expectation of adversity and this idea of embracing it and realizing that it was going to be part of the package and there was no avoiding it and you should not seek to avoid it. That's part of it. And the other upside, I think, is that, and he's talked about this with me and many others over the years, Rafa, is that when he got the diagnosis of Muller-Weiss, he was 19, 20 years old. And the doctor, initially told him, hey, there's a chance you won't be able to play at a high level. It's just the way it is. This is an unusual situation. You have this degradation in your bone in your foot. I mean, it's not going to bother you for living daily life and hanging out on the beach and in Porto Cristo and all that. But to go, change direction and romp around the courts of the world, probably not. So you hear that, and that's brutal. We shouldn't underestimate it. And I don't think at the time when we were covering him that it was really all that clear in real time what degree this had happened and what degree the problem was. And so I think we ended up maybe underplaying it a little bit at the time. Clearly, since then, not the case. But what that does create is this sense of seize the day. I don't know how long I'm going to be able to play. I don't know how long my foot's going to hold up. I don't know how long I'm going to be able to perform at something close to my max level. So I'm not letting any opportunities go. I think Rafa had that mentality anyway from having watched him very young, but it only accentuated it and made him more, I think, in the moment and grab it because I don't know how long I'll have it.
That's a very good point. And how you have interviewed Rafa many times over the years, right? And is there anything
Yep.
that stood out to you early about him as a person, And what was your kind of first thoughts when you started meeting him, you started seeing him on tour, and he started performing as early as he did?
That's a great question. I mean, I first saw him physically uh, was at Wimbledon on the outside courts there behind center court in front of the ivy. He was all white and he was playing an early round match. And I met Tony that day too. This is 2003. It was his first major. He had played the boys tournament the year before and had gone pretty deep. But he just, watching from a distance, it was like just this physical force and just power and movement. I was like, who is this unknown 25, 26-year-old? And then you got up close and it was like the chubby Rafa cheeks and a little bit of acne and just sort of, he looked not fully formed. The body was, there was still a little bit of baby fat, but it was just a powerful thing. And he was just this very kind of amazing mix of just intensely competitive, but positive energy. A lot of intense competitors in tennis history, as we know, at least the ones who exteriorize, are often very negative. Or there's like I'm going to crush you kind of feeling to it. There's like a almost animosity to it. Rafa, it was just this exuberance to compete. He wasn't smiling, but his body language and all his sort of his urgency to it was a very positive, almost overwhelming sort of thing. So that was the impression visually. And then we talked to him that day later on, And it was pretty clipped, pretty teen, not moody, but it was respectful. And at those days, my Spanish was probably at its peak. Back then, I had lived in Sevilla for 7 or 8 years. Wonderful place. My Spanish never got as good as it should have gotten during that time, but it got to a decent level. So I could definitely talk to Rafa and the Spanish players in Spanish, and that's what the interviews were done. And that was a huge advantage because to understand Rafa in the early years, especially, he didn't have much English, and it was really hard to get a feeling for him. But I was really struck by he had a lot of presence and a kind of an innate sort of dignity about him, I would say, even then, even as a teenager at 17, 18. And also I think he's got a good sense of humor, which doesn't really come through in English as much, comes through more in Spanish. But I really interviewed him a lot in those first 5, 6 years of his career, and got a good chance to know him. And I always felt like it was a real dialogue. It wasn't quite as conversational as you might have with a more mature athlete, but there was a lot of give and take, and he was curious, and I think he was really trying to figure out a way to transplant the code of Mallorca, Manacor, this sort of small town. Who do you trust? Who's a person who's viable and trustworthy? And that was very important to the Nadal family and to Rafa to figure that out from a young age. I think that was why he kind of got himself oriented. So he was creating connections, and a lot of the connections that he has in his team, and also in the media world and other people around him, they ended up being very, very long-term connections, which I guess should not be surprising for somebody from that community where deeply anchored in the place, deeply rooted, and you want to have these sort of deep relationships where you have the mutual trust. So all that was palpable at that time, and I'm just so glad that I happened to be able to be at a good level of Spanish then when I could really talk to him and understand him at that stage.
Yeah, it's definitely a difference with Rafa, especially in the early days. Like being in Spain myself as well. Like Sevilla, by the way, is an amazing city. And Rafa being so eloquent and quite like intellectual in Spanish, but then obviously early on he was a bit two dimensional in English, and I think that sometimes hurt him, and the humor didn't go through. While now he's pretty good at he's well versed in English. He can joke in English. I mean, usually the humor is the one thing that doesn't come out when it's not your first
Right. No,
language,
I
right? Like
agree.
that's
But it's still a little bit clipped. It's not quite Rafa in
yeah,
English. I don't know if you
exactly.
agree.
I
It
100%
never
agree.
it never has gotten there, and I think he still struggles with some of the syntax, and it's still work for him to speak in English. Definitely, better than his French, but I think that's exactly right. I think in Spanish there is a natural eloquence to Rafa and a natural wisdom that comes through. I think he's sort of viewed as sort of cute, sort of in English a little bit. Oh, that's a cute little comment that he made or
Yeah.
whatever else. It's the way he expresses himself. It's sort of, but in Spanish, it's not that. It's almost, and a lot of the sports writers, as I write in the book, are 20, 30 years older than Rafa. And he's sort of in there having a dialogue, holding court and, saying, it's not quite like that. I'm going to tell you what it's like. So Rafa is also not somebody who has any fear of debate. And I know Tony is that way too. So I haven't spent as much time with Rafa in recent years as I did in the early years, but definitely that love of a good argument and a good debate is kind of part of the Nadalian legacy for sure.
Yeah, how do you see the relationship with Tony? I was a bit surprised that he was not like showing up for the Davis Cup. He wasn't there for the final. It was a bit of a sad end to the Rafa legacy, in my opinion. The Malaga, the last Davis Cup match he played. And I don't think people would have wanted it in other ways, but you can never get exactly. And now he's getting something at the French Open, which is more fitting. But Tony wasn't there. And like, how have you seen their relationship evolve and act throughout the years?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been privy to a lot of the backdoor stuff. Of course, I wouldn't want to speculate on that, but it's clear. It's sort of it's the essential relationship in Rafa's career. Without Tony, he would not be a tennis player. There's no doubt. If that hadn't been a connection, he would have been a soccer player. I think that we can be 100% sure of that. So he kind of changed the destiny of sports by that. And I think Tony will tell you that the most pleasant years for him, the ones that were the richest for him, were when Rafa was becoming, kind of when he could pass on his wisdom, create this code, let him react to it, rub up against it, resist, not resist. I think, and sort of building that sort of player brick by brick from the early stages, what Tony really loved with Rafa. And I think he had let's be honest, he had a big measure of control at that point. So the emancipation, process for a guy like Tony was never going to be easy, even though Tony is an intelligent, sensitive person. But it was not going to have that level of autonomy and ownership. Somebody who gets that big as an athlete and matures is going to want to hear other voices. And ultimately, you think about it, it's almost more surprising that it lasted as long as it did than that it ultimately broke apart, because it's just a huge pressure, that sort of almost paternal. I'm not sure what the verb is for an uncle, but or the adjective is for an uncle, but that relationship of mentor and mentee, it had to change at some point. I mean, Borg had it with Lennart Berglund, even though he wasn't his relative, but Borg only played until 25 or 26. So you don't know how it would have evolved later on. So I think I'm sure there have been difficult moments for Tony along the way to sort of let go, feel like you're being a little bit marginalized. And that's, when he ends up announcing that they're not going to be together anymore, he's going to leave the team and go to the academy in early 2017. I mean, he doesn't even tell Rafa. He sort of lets it come out at a coaching conference in Budapest. And one of the things he says or jokes about is that he used to decide many things, and now he basically decides nothing because of people that have come in. So for sure there was frustration and some nostalgia, I'm sure, for Tony with those early years, but what critical early years they were. And I think it's absolutely important for this thing in Roland Garros for Tony to be somewhere in the stands. Huh? I'm sure he and Rafa maybe are not as close as they once were. I'm sure it's huge love and respect within the family, but he needs to be there. I mean, he's just too big a factor. The Davis Cup thing was, I think, certainly not an intentional slight. He had another commitment he couldn't get out of, and nobody knew Rafa was going to be playing Davis Cup at that point when he made those plans, and he was planning on coming in for the weekend if they would have beaten the Netherlands in that quarterfinal match, but then they end up losing, and it kind of all becomes I'd say a little too low key, the whole thing, and sort of a little too off the cuff. It feels like. I like the part where Rafa grabs the mic and sort of directly talks to the public for 12 minutes. Just who can do that, right? He just kind of philosophized with the Spanish public. That was special, but yeah, I think he needs something really powerful and ceremonial, and he'll get that at Roland Garros this year, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think it's good for tennis because, like, I think we were so spoiled as tennis watchers, lovers, nerds over many years. With Rafa, Roger, Novak now, maybe on the Swan Song here, and then you forget that you were that spoiled. Yeah, like you kind of like, oh, I remember that was magical. Like because you become like a kid. You're like, oh well, this is supposed to happen. Rafa's supposed to win the French Open. Federer dominates on the grass. Blah 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 blah. And on it goes. And now we're entering a period of a little more uncertainty, even though we have Sinner and we have Alcaraz. They've been like the two poster boys for this new generation of tennis players, although many new other guys coming up as well. But I think it's important to cherish that era and like have a proper like celebration because it was a huge thing. And I think also interesting that I want to get into like is that Rafa's relationship with the French. Like I know you've lived in France and you have strong connections to France, right? So it's like that connection of like in the beginning they were not really taken by him so much. I remember that like, oh, this guy is winning every year. We don't like it. It's boring. We have French players. We have Gasquet. We have Monfils. And but now like okay, they in the Olympics he got to carry the torch. Pretty huge show of affection for a non-French person. That's pretty impressive, I would say. And now they're doing the proper send-off kind of thing. And it seems like this relationship has gone from like, okay, we're not sure about this guy, to like complete adoration of even someone non-French.
Yeah, it's beautifully said. I mean, it's been quite a journey, and I think it's obviously the most important journey is Rafa with the Spanish and the people there, and obviously Spain has its own divisions and own issues, and it's not always easy to unify in a world of Barca and Real Madrid and all those sorts of things. I mean, not an easy place to have a national sort of hero like that, but he did transcend all those borders a lot of the time, a few exceptions, despite being a passionate Real Madrid supporter. But in France, it was a complex thing, and my wife's French. My kids are binational, and I spent a lot of time there, and I speak the language very comfortably. And Roland Garros is the tournament that I know the best of all the sports events that I've covered. So I think I have a pretty good grasp of where that thing has come from and where it ended up. And I would say early years fascination, prodigy, force of nature, like you said, just embraced him, I thought, pretty fully in 2005 when he finally made it. People forget he should have played in 2003, ended up with a crazy thing happening, like falling over a net, hurting himself, couldn't play. 2004 injury, he can't play, but he already knew what a force he could be. And so there was a huge buildup and anticipation, and he arrives having won Monte Carlo and Rome and everything else when he came to Roland Garros the first time. So he arrives as a favorite. And that's quite a burden, quite a thing. I don't recall that ever happening in any other major, not at the French Open in my memory anyway. And then he does it. He converts, doesn't even play a 5-setter, and he wins the first one. So that was love affair, I thought. And he looks different. He's got the sleeveless and the clam diggers and the long hair and exotic look. And it was just a great thing and all kinds of vibes. And 06 was pretty good too. But then it just because he was becoming such a force and clearly going to dominate, and he ends up, reeling off 4 to start. The French like their underdogs, and they like their variety and don't want dominance. They want to have some suspense in their tournament. So that was part of it. And the other part, which I have a whole chapter on, is an interesting part. Maybe comes out a bit more later, was, let's face it, the issue of doping and a lot of the allegations and concerns that were out there about not just Rafa, obviously, but so many athletes in this era coming off of, think about France and what they experienced with Lance Armstrong and the Tour. There's so much skepticism and so many cycling scandals and track and field scandals and everything. So we've all experienced it as sports fans, sports nerds. So Rafa, never been any proof of anything like that, but there was certainly lots of speculation because of the climate in which he arrived. And when you dominate to that degree and you look so strong and robust and physical, there's going to be people that question that. And I think that, it would be unfair to not mention that, because I think it was part of the reason why Rafa struggled in the French public's eyes a bit to get his due. And there were satirical cartoons with him with syringes and all kinds of stuff. So a lot to deal with for him. And ultimately, he went to court to fight the French minister who talked about one of his long absences being linked to a positive test, and he's absolutely not true, and ended up winning the case. So in all my reporting, I've never found any evidence of anything. So, but it did play a role in how the French public viewed him. And it took time for them to come to, I think, a place of peace with him. And Rafa was pretty consistent with the French public all along, but it has been really moving. And I think if you know the whole story, quite interesting and a little surprising to see to what degree the French have embraced him as, all right, you just can't get rid of him. We might as well just learn to accept it, and ultimately not just accept, but really, really embrace it. And the Olympics was a great example of that, and getting the honor of the torch and passing, getting it from Zidane of all people. So it was very symbolic. And I think a true reflection. Rafa has earned everybody's respect with the way he conducted his career, but the French were probably one of the harder ones to conquer, but he did it.
Yeah, they are, and they like the artists as well generally, like and the flair and I think like when Rafa came in, he had quite bulging biceps, and he showed them off. It was kind of that a little bit of anti-hero vibes in a way of like now he's coming to take Federer, who's the l'artiste, he was the elegant guy, and Rafa just goes and destroys him, in the 08 final. I think he got 4 games, Roger, right? So there was obviously that. I think also like it was easy to embrace for them, Roger than Rafa, and Rafa was so dominant. Like nobody likes too much domination. I think it's I can understand that. And then with the doping stuff, the doping is always interesting in tennis. Now we have Sinner, of course, with this coming off this situation with Klosterball. Everybody has different opinions of that, and what happens now, how will it be received? Obviously in Rome, it's all good maybe, but then we will see from the tennis world. It's always like a little bit of whispers in the locker rooms, and everybody's on Adderall, everybody's doing this, and the doping is always there, in the background.
Yeah, I mean, I think all sports in this era have had to deal with skepticism and cynicism, and ultimately sports has done it to itself. I mean, with the abuses over time, and there were moments when tennis, frankly, didn't do a great job of controlling and of policing the situation. I do feel there's a lot more oversight now, and I mean, obviously, the independent agency that's running anti-doping in tennis now has gotten a lot of criticism, and there have been some inconsistencies in how their rulings are adjudicated afterward on appeal and things like that. But I can guarantee you that tennis is doing a more thorough job now than it was when I started covering tennis 30 plus years ago. There were many things that weren't tested for. There were hardly any, if any, out of competition tests unannounced, and there was no blood testing. So clearly the the oversight is better now, but still the issue is, as like in English we say, a bad penny. It keeps turning up. I mean, these issues continue to surface because it's important. Athletes are held to a certain standard, and Sinner, all the ruling, if you read it carefully, there's no at all sense that it was intentional. But you need rules and you need guidelines, and so if you start to allow people to blame their entourages for what happens and use that as their reason not to be punished, then you have to be able to have oversight over the entourage, and the athlete ultimately should be responsible for what goes in their body. And I guess that's where we've come to, and I think that's the best and fairest place to be. But it's going to create some tough situations where some athletes who probably don't deserve it are going to be punished, and some athletes who might deserve a longer suspension are going to have shorter suspensions. But I do feel better than I did at the beginning of my career about where tennis and a lot of sports are in terms of the anti-doping fight.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's getting better, but it's maybe slower than people would have liked, But that's of course how life is. Was the work as hard with this book? I wanted to get into that, like as the title suggests, like the warrior. With the master, you have like the elegance and flair and seeming effortlessness, of Roger. It's just everything looks so easy. With Rafa, it looks like work. It is work, but it's amazing work. It's impressive work. Like, was the work harder here? Was there the different approach to the research? How did you feel about the process?
It's a great question. I have in the introduction, I don't know if you remember or not. I know you read the book. There's a little section in there when I talk about writing about Nadal, and you kind of feel like you want to suffer too when you're writing.
I like that. I like that part a lot. Yeah,
you want it to be hard. You want it to be. You want to feel the pain and
play on the keyboard.
You want to get into the routines, and you kind of want exactly. So there's an element of that for sure. I mean, I think I called it method writing instead of method acting. I mean, I think that was a fun thing to realize in yourself as you were doing it, trying to kind of get in character a little bit. It was a challenge in some ways because having written the Federer book, I mean, Nadal is 5 years younger, but he and Roger just have so many cross-pollination and overlaps. And I really didn't want to write anything resembling the same book. And I wouldn't have written a book if I was approaching it as a classic biography. I think what made this one both really challenging and really rewarding for me was the structure and the format that I chose. And that is, Rafa and the clay, Rafa and Roland Garros. And the book kind of zooms into Rafa. It's got his whole career in there, but it zooms into Rafa, and then it zooms into Roland Garros, or it zooms into the clay for a chapter. And I wanted to have this sort of dual structure where hopefully Rafa is the thread, of course, but you'd have a deep understanding of both the man and the place, how they changed each other, how they've become one in a way. They really have. And this ceremony on the 25th of May is a great indicator of that. It'll never be the same again because of what he did. And obviously he was changed by it as well. But I don't know there have been a lot of sports biographies like that, where you have such a deep look at a place and the history of it and all those who shaped it before he arrives. And then you have him in his own sort of parallel development on the side. So to write that was very challenging because you didn't want it to feel like two books sort of slapped together. You wanted to keep it connected and keep, the story and the thread of Rafa's amazing career going. And so I think that was a completely different challenge than writing about Federer. The Master is much more written about Roger and his rivals, but it's, very Roger based and based on the places that mattered to Roger and places where we met over the years, places that he had deep connections, be it Dubai or South Africa or Basel or whatever it is. Rafa, you know where he's from. You know where he's from, Jonas. You've been there many times. So it's just, this is more about let's bring these two threads together. And honestly, it was the hardest thing I've done. in my career so far, trying to make that work.
Yeah, but it works because the connection between him and the surface, like I talked about, it's almost like he has some clay in his blood, right? Like there's some parts
Yeah,
of clay in the bloodstream of Rafa, and that's what makes him the warrior. And I think that really works. But I understand that from a writing point of view, it must be a challenge. During the research process, or like going through your notes and all the interviews and stuff, was there anything that surprised you again, like, or made you, wow, yeah, this was a new thing for me, or this was something that kind of I forgot about and now kind of came up to my senses?
well, I think I learned a lot that I didn't know, and I think some of the stuff that I went back and looked at actually knocked on to things I was able to explore and research more for the book this time. One thing I didn't know, and I was very surprised to learn. Have you met Joffrey Porta? Do you know him?
No, no.
He's a Spanish coach based out of Mallorca. He's from the mainland, but he was a guy who was running a Spanish national training center when Rafa was young. Tony knows him well. He played a role in advising Tony and Rafa. When Rafa played Miami Open first time with Federer in 2004, Joffrey was traveling with him. Like Tony Colom also played a role like that, where he traveled with Rafa sometimes, coach from Mallorca. But Joffrey told me that Rafa, and if you look back at like the Petitas and some of the early videos of Rafa, he is playing at hyperspeed, not during the point, between the points. He is like serving, get the balls, serve, no delay. I mean, it's just like Nick Kyrgios or something. It's super
Yeah.
fast. So, and then you look at where we ended up with just the most ponderous, routine, tick-filled sort of thing. So I don't think I'd fully grasped how that happened, how that transition was made, or that he even played at hyperspeed when he was young. But Joffrey told me that they were worried he was going to burn himself out, that he was using up too much energy, wasn't getting enough time to rest or sort of reboot between points. So Tony started giving him a couple extra balls, like pick through the balls and pick the ball, just to kind of slow him down. And then, routines sort of started to be established to deal with the stress. And then it just became kind of a monster, honestly. And it went probably too far, farther than Rafa would have liked. But, maybe just a bit like Federer, who was this hothead and couldn't control himself and then became like Mr. Greek statue, Mr. Zen, at least on the outside. Rafa also was playing against type. I mean, maybe he would prefer to play at a Kyrgios type pace deep inside of him, but he created all these layers to help him have the pace he needed. And it's true. I mean, Nike told me that they actually had to develop a special fabric for Rafa because he sweats so much. And they had to find a way to, absorb some of that in his clothing and everything else. So clearly he had some physical obstacles and mental obstacles that he had to fight and change, but they also created some new ones. So that was a big revelation, to be sure. And I think also the role that a lot of those people played, like Porta and Tony Colom and obviously Francis Roig all through Rafa's career as an assistant coach to Tony. Just how important all those people that were really in the shadows were to the overall success and contributing to Tony's ability to kind of mastermind, but take a champion from age 3 or 4 to the top of the game. And they obviously had won over 10, 11 Grand Slam singles titles by the time they separated, if not more, by 2017. So it's an amazing achievement, but it kind of took a village. So those were some of the things that I learned along the way.
Yeah, there's so many things about Rafa that makes him an icon in the game, and the ticks is one thing. Like the people will remember, I think, for always. Like the water bottles is one of those like most common like joking memes that you see on Instagram and stuff. People using the water bottles, they pulling the pants out of their ass, and they adjusting their sweat with the banana. They're all these things that came out of kind of like nowhere. You're thinking, but tennis is a sport where a lot of nervous energy are being expelled, and I think Rafa has loads of energy. You see it when he eats. When you're sitting next to him and he eats like a plate of pasta. This guy eats pasta like it's gonna run out. It's like, he can
he's
eat
a force
quite.
of nature, not just on a tennis court, right?
This guy
Yeah,
has like a lot of energy. You feel it, and I think maybe that's part of the when you're close to Rafa, you're talking to him or something. He has a lot of charisma, like a lot of, but also a lot of energy in the room. You feel the room like fills up with some energy. It's like the force of nature again. And
yeah,
I
and
think that's
you think it's because it's Nadal, right? So it's Nadal, but I don't think it's just that. I think
no.
it's something about just the presence, the way he carries himself, and even when he was very young, before he became Rafa, you could feel that when he walked in. There's a innate dignity to it, like a poise and a gravitas there, and there is that sort of dynamism and energy and life force in him for sure. And it's interesting. I think he might even have been judged hyperactive as a youth.
Yep.
And Federer is the same. Federer was very hyperactive. I mean,
Yep.
he couldn't look you in the eye, supposedly, from his coaches because he was so keyed up to get out and just hit and compete and use up all that life force. And ultimately, these guys lasted as long as they did, maybe because there was so much energy at the core, you know? And I
Yeah,
think
that's an
it's
interesting take, actually. Like all that energy, and maybe you need that as to become like a supreme athlete on the highest level. Like you need that kind of energy, you know. And you with Rafa, I find it funny. Like if you're next to him, he's not super tall. He's like 185, right? 1 meter 85 centimeters, and you can be next to Del Potro, who's super tall, but Rafa almost feels bigger. Like he feels like he's a giant. You know, there's something about him. And I'm not saying like, oh, wow, it's Rafa. It's just something, you know. So I find that quite interesting. Also in the book with all his energy and that he didn't have these tics before. But I think all tennis players looking for ways to manage nerves. It's like you're alone. The whole world is watching. If you're playing on a high level, you're very nervous. You're going to throw up a serve. How do you collect your emotions? You know, how do you focus in on the point? And then you can have 60 ticks. You can look at the strings. You can count to something. You can, you know, adjust your pants or whatever. So it's like you see Iga, who is also, you mentioned like as a huge Rafa fan, that she also does a lot of things, you know, to manage her emotions. It becomes like kind of an important thing, a kind of noticeable thing as an observer as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's, you know, Christian Marcoli, who was the performance psychologist from Switzerland, who worked with Roger for a couple of years at a critical phase in Roger's teen years when he was trying to overcome this the temper that he had and the frustration and the acting out that he was doing. And I don't think without that change, Roger could have been a champion, but he did find a way to do it. But Christian said that for him, you know, that's the hardest thing about tennis is that all that downtime, all that time between plays, if you will, or points that you have to manage. And it's a mental challenge. Obviously, you want to recover, but really it's how you, and he says, in my view, at the highest level, those 25 seconds or 30 seconds between the points, how you manage that is the difference between success and failure often. And I think that, you know, Rafa's way of doing it was very different than Federer's, very different than Djokovic's, although Djokovic with the bouncing and all that sort of thing with the balls. But Rafa's whole deal is much more elaborate and, or at least much more obvious and evident. And, you know, I think Rafa would have preferred not to have had to go to that level to make it work. He said that. But, you know, the one thing that you asked about, looking back at my notes, one of our first big interviews was in Monte Carlo in 05. And one of the things he said to me was, it's a bad tick and I got to get rid of it. And I know I will. And I got to get rid of it. And he's talking about grabbing the back of his shorts.
Yeah.
20 years ago, you know, so he knew then, but he never stopped. So
he added the shoulders.
I use that as the beginning of one of the chapters because it's just a very human thing, right? We all do it, and we all have things we can't quite beat. But you're absolutely right. I think tennis, that dead time between performance is a really tricky thing, and I mean golfers certainly have it, and other sports, but tennis is such a critical thing to be able to manage it. And Rafa's way was to just lay routine upon routine, so he didn't think about the bigger picture, and he stayed very small picture, you know.
Yeah, and I wonder if we will see some ticks develop from other players, because you see some players like, I mean, that they pay homage, or they do some, they try to imitate, even if they're not that much younger. In this case, you know, we have like Carlitos maybe not being so similar with Rafa, but you're probably going to see players that are trying to copy, you know, and like, for example, the Vamos just is now a global thing. You know, everybody says Vamos everywhere around the world in a tennis club, even if they're from the Philippines, UK, Sweden, whatever. Like, it's a Vamos. You say Vamos, a lot of them, or at least, and I do. And it's funny, that's just a Rafa thing, because he was always so exuberant early on. You described that in the Davis Cup chapter when he beats Roddick. It was like, this guy is just like, after every important point, just like Vamos jumping, and he calmed down quite a bit. But in the beginning, he had so much Vamos energy all the time. You know, it's like, yeah, I remember that now, but I forgot about it.
It's like you use it as a noun. So much Vamos. Yeah. It's a noun, right?
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
true. You can use it any way you want, but no, it's true. And again, it goes back to what we said before about life force and that sort of innate dynamism and vitality in somebody. And he had it. I mean, I guess I'm trying to think about, I wouldn't say someone like Steffi Graf had that. Steffi Graf was much more inward.
Yep.
I never sensed that Steffi was like maybe a little bit at the end of her career at times, at points of victory, but it was all happening internally, but didn't stop her from being a great player. Chrissy Everett, similar, kind of thing. I'm not sure it has to be there. Maybe that's a different kind of thing, but certainly there are a lot of wonderful athletes and tennis players we can think of that do have that quality and helps your candle burn longer. I'm sure it does.
What do you think, like a record of Rafa's? Like, there's 22 slams, Novak is 24, Roger ended up on 20. What do you think that puts in the heads of guys like Alcaraz and Sinner, for example, if you use those two? Like, do you think that becomes like a mountain that they like keen to climb and it helps, or do you think it's too much of a mountain and it kind of shoots them down a little bit and they're like, well, I'm never going to reach 20, so I'm not going to work that hard. I mean, obviously they're working very hard, but it may be something in their mental sphere that is always there because these three giants did all this amazing achievements.
That's a wonderful question, and I think it's going to be an ongoing study, if you will, of these guys' psychology. Did you hear Carlos's comments in Monte Carlo and Barcelona this year about Rafa?
Yeah.
He talks about the fact that he was almost, again, describing a natural phenomenon a little bit. And he knows Rafa now. They're connected, and Rafa's definitely a supporter of his. And I think that's great for Carlos. But I think Carlos could really feel the weight of Nadal's achievements this year in a new way. And he talked about that very openly. I thought that was fascinating. And after losing in Barcelona, and he talked about just, you have to live this and experience this from the inside to understand just what Rafa did achieve. And I'm looking at those numbers now, and I'm looking at what he achieved, and I can tell you it just seems almost impossible, almost unthinkable when you're the one trying to do this now. And he's, of course, 21, 22 years old, could be just starting out on his path. You hope the body holds up and all that. But I think for sure it's, I don't know, the Egyptians who came after the guys who built the pyramids. You kind of look it up going, wow, okay.
Good luck.
That's going to take a lot of work to get all those stones up from, down the Nile all the way up. It's a big thing. And I think it's probably a lot healthier for all these guys coming up not to look too much at the top of the mountain and maybe look at the base camps a bit more along the way, because it can seem like an impossible feat. And I guess in some ways maybe takes a little bit of the pressure off because people know how outstanding and astounding these things are. So I'm not sure any of us expect Alcaraz to hit 14 French Opens or Sinner to get to 24 Grand Slams. But, the bar has moved to a unexpected and extremely lofty place. So as they do things in their career, inevitably there will be comparisons, and it's going to be hard to stack up. And I think they in their bones know that. And I think, or at least Carlos is realizing that. And that's got to be tough at some point to accept that.
Yeah, and people are hard with their expectations. Like, I mean, tennis is not getting less competitive. It's getting, I would say, more competitive every year. More and more talents are popping up from all kinds, all over the world. And we grew up kind of in that sense with Rafa just being expected to just vacuum the whole clay court season. He was just like, okay, he wins Monte Carlo, then he wins Madrid, then he wins Rome, and we didn't think about it. It's completely insane that one person does that. Like, plays so many matches on clay and just wins every match. And then in Carlito's case, obviously, it was what you referred to is like, well, why? Oh, now you won Barcelona, so now you will win this and this and this, and that's not feasible, And those kind of expectations on a 20-year-old guy, he has already won 4 slams, which is already super amazing. But it's funny how quickly we're like, okay, now that's the next Rafa, then we have another Rafa, and then it's not like that how it works.
Right. Especially because they seem to have passed the torch a little bit, last couple of seasons. I will never forget Indian Wells, back when Carlos was just emerging and Rafa was having a great season, and he was watching the TV in the press room after the press conference was over with his hand on his chin, kind of Rafa like this, just intensely gazing at Alcaraz playing Cameron Norrie on the TV. And he was just checking it out. And he was going to play Alcaraz the next round if Alcaraz won. And he was just bored in looking at this. And you could just see, he was like, this guy's a player. This guy's a factor. And finally, somebody's coming along who also could be my rival, but above all could carry the torch and the legacy in Spain. But it was just intense concentration. He didn't even notice us looking at him, looking at Carlos. So, it's a lot, but better to have had the connection with Rafa, better to feel that support, better to have him as a resource. And also, Rafa's going to be going, the Spanish media will be going to Rafa for the next 20, 30 years, asking him for comments on every player who arrives. Good to have Rafa on your side and your team and pulling for you, because he does understand the pressures in a unique way that are on a Spanish tennis player.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. He's going to be there as a little bit of a role model, I think. And I wanted to get into the French Open quickly, right? Like you have a strong connection and love for this tournament. It's one of the four slams, of course, and it's an icon in the calendar. How do you think it has developed over the last, let's say, the years you've covered it, like you 30 years, the last 10 years at least?
Oh, I mean, it's unrecognizable, to be honest. It's incredible changes physically. I mean, they've all changed
Yeah.
tremendously over the years. Wimbledon still sort of feels like they've kind of kept the brand, if you will. It's sort of, they've obviously built up around and everything else. Center court's 100 years old, but the roof changes many things. And, the Aussie Open, US Open are all in different places now, and they just keep growing. But the French Open transformation has been radical, and they haven't moved, but just almost hardly anything left from when I started 30 years ago. Almost every building, every structure has been changed pretty much completely. And I remember being with Gilles Jourdain, who was the man who was managing the great construction project that created the new Chatrier court and all the new grounds and everything else. Huge project. And Gilles has been at Roland Garros for 40 years. And I was sitting with him in Chatrier and looking down at the court, and he's like pointing to the center court clay, and he goes, "At least we still have that. We have that. That was very important to keep that rectangle in the same place, so that Lacoste and Barotra and Cochet and the Musketeers, their sweat went down into that clay, down into the rocks. So at least they have that one connection. But that's about all they had left. Everything else is neoclassical, changed, and I can't say it's not impressive, because it is. And I think they have upgraded the grounds, and I love the greenhouse court, which was obviously a huge legal battle to get access to building that court, and the botanical gardens. I like the new court 14 on the far end of the grounds. Where I used to live in that area, it was public courts over there, hard courts. So they've managed to kind of colonize all these different areas that connect to Roland Garros to keep it there. But court 14 is kind of based on the Pietrangeli court and the Italian Open, so sunken court, got a lot of atmosphere. So they've done some great things, but it does in many ways feel a bit like a new tournament. But the story of Roland Garros is an interesting one, because we see these Grand Slams now, and they all seem like they were always meant to be that way. But Roland Garros was in a precarious position, much like the Australian Open, for a lot of the 70s and the 80s. And it was not at all a given that it would remain a Grand Slam or a major, and not at all a given that it would have the success and prosperity that it has developed. And I think that was another interesting thing in researching the book and going back in the past, was the importance. People go, well, why the heck are you calling the court Philippe Chatrier? It should be called Nadal, or it should be called Yannick Noah, or something else. And I understand the argument, but Chatrier, no Chatrier as the French president, and no Roland Garros of the way we know it. I mean, he was a critical figure and pivotal in being able to protect it, rebuild it, and very limited means economically at a time when it was really down. And he was the one who kind of navigated that. Had his detractors, to be sure, but he was a brilliant administrator, and he truly loved French tennis and had a deep connection to the Musketeers. He had played with a couple of them when he was a young boy, so he knew them personally, and he took that connection very seriously. So it was important to me in this book, if you're telling the story of Rafa and of Roland Garros, that you make the connection and the thread to that distant past and the French Musketeers, who were such a big part of French tennis history, and the reason why Roland Garros was built, because the Musketeers beat the U.S. in Davis Cup in 1927 at the Germantown Cricket Club in Philadelphia, and they needed a big stadium because Davis Cup was a big deal. So that's why they built Roland Garros. No Musketeers, no Davis Cup. They would have had a bigger tournament, to be sure, but probably not Roland Garros. That ground would have been sold to somebody else and moved in a different place, and it probably wouldn't have happened the way that it happened. So the connections are interesting. So what Rafa, the house that Rafa ultimately became part owner of, the story of the house is a fascinating one, and I really love digging into all that. Honestly, it was my favorite part of the research, and going back and reading from Arthur Kessler, the great writer, about being interned at Roland Garros during World War II, the beginning of the conflict when they were rounding up suspected communists before the Germans invaded and put barbed wire around Roland Garros and turned it into a camp. And the posters of the Musketeers and the matches were still up on the walls, and here they are, basically captives in this place. So it's had a lot of different iterations over the decades, and the history is quite a fascinating one.
And important to capture. I think you do it beautifully because I think this is like now we just take all these tournaments for granted, but a lot of changed in tennis history, right? Like, I mean, we have French Open had, like, I remember that as well. Like, it had a little bit of a topsy-turvy history overall, but like the Australian Open, of course, was not even looked at as a slam for many years. And it's like these things we forget because now all these brands, where there are brands, are powerhouses. Like the tennis brands, like iconic tennis brands, they have so much power really in the minds of us. And now this year they also introduced this queuing system where you have to have like you can be part of a raffle to buy tickets and stuff, kind of Wimbledon style. That's new for this year, and it seems like more and more people every year. I've gone, like, it seems like there's more and more people at the French Open. Like any sporting event, really, it feels like it's good, but it's also for spectators, it's good to be expectant of there's going to be a lot of people there.
Yeah, I always describe the experience of going to Roland Garros as like it's like the Paris metro at rush hour a lot of the time. You're better off. Used to be in the early days, you'd be good to go bounce from court to court and kind of snack and see a little bit of outside court here and developing youngster here. It's just so hard to get around. And they've always done this. They say, oh, well, we're going to expand it and then there'll be more room. Well, what happens? They expand it and then there are more fans. And and the space fills up. It's like building an 8-lane highway in California, You keep building all the lanes that you want. The lanes are going to get filled up eventually. So, I've kind of lost hope on that one. But when you are in your seat at Roland Garros and you get that seat and you hang on to it for dear life because it's a precious thing, and the sun's going down and the shadows are going across the courts, and you are, the Bois de Boulogne is just past you with the trees around, and Eiffel Tower from the top of the Chatrier you can see, still pretty magical. And, it's maybe not as intimate and cozy as it once was, but it's still a special experience. And these majors have just gone from strength to strength. Maybe too much for the good of the game in some ways, but it's definitely they've managed to monetize and grow in a massive way in the last 20 to 30 years, and really separated themselves. So we'll see what the Masters 1000s can do now with these packages that they've created in the 12 days, which I don't know how you feel about it. I don't like it. I think it's too much downtime and takes up too much calendar space and kind of wears the players out mentally, I think, too much. And also, I write about this in the book, I think it risks diluting maybe the power of the majors too, because if you have 2-week events all the time, yes, you have best of 5 for the men for now, but you lose a little bit of that special quality, which is important for making champions and telling the general public, tune in now. This really matters. That's an important thing to be able to say.
Yeah, we have 4 world championships, as I see it, in tennis a year. Like in football, there's every 4 years. We have 4 every 1 year, every year. And I don't think the calendar needs more tennis, right? Like most players would agree, I would say. Like adding these days to the Masters, I talk to quite a lot of players, when I'm around the tournament, like, what do you think about this? And I haven't heard one player say anything good about it. It's like it's just, it puts a lot of strain on them as well, because if you lose early, I talked to an American player, like high-ranking, and he said, like, oh, if I lose first round, like, what do I do? How does my calendar look like? Am I hanging around paying my hotel for the coaches, paying my own hotel? Because obviously, as soon as you're out of the tournament, all the hospitality from the tournament is gone, right? So that puts also a little bit of strain on their wallets. And like, how do I go play a challenger next week? What do I do? So
there's been a lot of that. You can see like Indian Wells, the challengers that have been created, and that's a much longer standing circuit. Obviously, Indian Wells, Miami, with those 2-week events, which may not be the best use of everybody's time either, but there have been a lot of challengers that have sprouted up to kind of fill those gaps. Is that ideal? It's hard to promote that. You don't know who's going to play until the last minute. Not so great, but there will be responses and reactions. But the players are not complaining about the profit sharing, though. Probably there are no complaints about that.
No,
they are getting bigger checks, and the Masters 1000s are anteed up for that. So it isn't like they're just having this imposed on them with no rewards. But I think it's too much. Personally, I agree with you.
I agree. So now we have a French Open coming up. I'm going for a bit. You're going to be there as well. What do you think? Like, who are your what are your hot takes for this French Open? Like, we have Sinner, we have Alcaraz, we have Novak, although he's been pretty much missing during this season. I've seen him a lot here in Puente Romano here in Marbella, but uh, mainly training a little bit. So there's a lot of question marks around his form. It's been non-existent pretty much coming in. So who do you have? Like, what do you think is going to happen in this French Open?
Yeah, I mean, Novak also, don't forget, amazing last year performance at the Olympics, just epic, incredible. But that's best of three, and best of five now at this stage against all these threats that are out there. I don't know, but you could say it gives him time to problem solve and all that, but also can wear you down at that stage in your career for sure, late 30s like that. So I think it's a fascinating one on the men's side, really actually on both sides, because on the women's side, Swiatek is obviously vulnerable. I wouldn't be surprised to see her bounce back, strongly in Rome, which obviously has similar conditions to Roland Garros. But if I look at the men's side, Alcaraz has been a flickering flame. Sinner can obviously be great on clay, but it's not his best surface, and he's coming back. You've seen. I personally I don't cheer for players. I like storylines. I'd like to see Casper Ruud do well, personally. I feel like the guy's paid his dues. He's a great guy. Spent a lot of time interviewing him, early in his career, and I think he really understands the clay. And Madrid isn't the best transition to Roland Garros. I know he won there, and it's not the best comparison. But in a year when the guys who were logically going to win might be a bit down, and Casper has been down and out, but now kind of rising again. Maybe Casper's curve can meet at the right one. So I think he'll do well. Zverev, obviously, if Sinner and Alcaraz are down, Zverev in pure clay court ability and clay court game should be the guy who's able to pull it off and finally win his major. But he's had an unusual, unsettling sort of campaign as well. So there's really no, in my mind, obvious clear favorite. If they all play their best on clay, I think Alcaraz wins. Personally, I think he's just got that extra special connection to the surface, and he can create and has the shape on his shots and all those things. But I don't think he's there. So you wonder. I don't see a Draper doing it. I think it's just too much of a physical ask for him. I think he's going to burn out. Can't take that yet, but he's a factor. Menchik I don't think is perfect on clay yet, but he's maybe our U.S. Open is a different situation. But so I kind of look at Ruud, Zverev, Sinner, Alcaraz as those. I think it comes out of those four personally. What do you think?
Yeah, those are good picks. I think now Ruud has really showed, like, I mean, he's obviously a very good clay court player. Like, he has his game for the clay courts. He's like a
Yep.
slightly taller David Ferrer, I usually say, but he has a little bit more weapons maybe. But yeah, he's made for the surface. He loves it. He doesn't like the grass. He's one of those that thinks it's for cows, I think. so he focuses heavily now on French Open. And I predicted like Zverev might be his time now earlier in the season, but this kind of like he fell off a cliff a little bit, so it's now very difficult. So as you said, this is extremely open. Like Carlitos has also been up and down, like really tough to see any kind of steadiness. It's like a little bit all over the place. Sinner is a question mark because of his late entry here. He might be super fresh. He looks a bit more built up, so maybe it's good or bad. We'll see. So yeah,
Team B, you got Holger Rune, and then you have Musetti, who both had strong years so far on the clay and are great clay court players. So those guys could maybe sneak in if things fall their way, But Holger looked really good, obviously.
Yep.
Early in the clay court season, he's had some physical issues, but he looked like he'd hit a different level just after that disappointing Indian Wells final.
Yeah, and Cerundolo has been good as well.
Sorry.
Cerundolo has been good as well, I would say. But maybe for like an upset, he's not going to win the tournament. But maybe
I just haven't seen him play the biggest points well. Maybe he can do it, but he seems like he's a little brittle mentally, and he's had some opportunities to really break through, and he hasn't quite been able to navigate those pressure points the way you'd want to see a potential Grand Slam champion do it. Women's side, yeah, I guess I feel like Sabalenka's paid all the dues this year.
Yeah.
She's still pretty hungry, you can feel, because she's had some disappointments in big matches. It's not like she's been cruising at all. She's had a lot of frustration, but her level's high. Her level's very high. And I think the style of play that she plays, she's become a lot more secure in her game now. We'll get the free points still. I mean, she's not a big favorite in my mind, but I do think she deserves at this stage to be a slight favorite. And if I had to pick anybody, I would pick her. But it is an interesting one with a player like Coco Gauff has hit some high points, but then sort of old demons come back. Yeah, someone like Ostapenko's had a couple of runs, but that's more the indoor without the errors. Swiatek clearly has the best game for clay. And then you have someone like a Deanna Schneider who's coming up, who's destroying some opponents on clay. I met her very early in her career. Russian, is trained all over the place. Interesting person. Played at NC State in the U.S. college game for a season. She told me she just loves the clay. That's always been her best surface, even though she's had good results as a junior on other things and early in her career. But she loves the clay, and I think that embrace of the surface with her weapons, factor Andreeva as well, who's with Schneider in that generation and has had an amazing year. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see Andreeva win it. So it's a good year. But if I had to pick anybody, I think I'd pick Sabalenka.
That would be my pick as well. I mean, I know like Paulini, she can have an amazing period on clay, but it's very like uneven, So Sabalenka, she will always be there. She's there. Like Swiatek seems a little bit too up and down now, like with her results and like her mental health. Maybe it seems a little bit on and off. I don't know. I mean, I don't know her personally, but it doesn't look like someone you would put money on, like, to put it like that, Coco Gauff maybe, but Sabalenka feels like the safest bet, and that's my feeling, But the men's is even more open in my opinion. I think Sabalenka is quite semi-strong in my head, but the men's, that's a tough one. That I don't really know.
We like it like that.
We like it like that.
As I wrote the other day, I think I told somebody else this too. I like the fact that tennis has surprises, but I don't want parity.
No,
don't give me parity.
True. That's true. No parity.
And that's the beauty of the Big Three era, wasn't it? Maybe it was a little bit too much unparity in that era, but we had these rotating rivalries playing off each other and so many big matches to look forward to on a routine basis. And that was such a special thing about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So the final question really is about that. So we have three GOATs, let's say. Well, you can argue about that all day long on the internet if you want. But what's next for you? I mean, you have your Substack that's going well. You're writing there. You're covering tennis as usual. You're now out to publish this one. You're publishing tour marketing for the book and so on. Is the next book going to be Novak Djokovic? And what would be a title for that book in that case?
Yeah, that is the question. I'm asking myself too. All I know is I think it's a logical thing to think about doing. Obviously, and I'm not going to tell you the title because I'd kind of like to save it just in case.
Yeah, I know. We talked about it last time, but
do you have one in mind? Let me know yours, and I'll tell you if you're on the right track. The what?
The what? Yeah, no,
what would you put? The blank. What do you put?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was like, the first word that came into my head was the mechanic. I don't know why. It doesn't make any sense at all. But like something, it's more that the one thing that stands out about Novak is his like his way to battle adversity. Like we talked about Rafa, so we're getting back to that. Like Rafa was so good at positive like reinforcement of the difficulty of competition, right? So he was so good at being like, I love competing, vamos, vamos, vamos all day. While Novak is like, he kind of seems to take a little bit more of a, I take your negative energy and I put it in my furnace and I make fire. Like that's like he really burns for that negative energy. But it would be tough to find a word because he's obviously the guy that can do it all. On the tennis court, he's like the AI tennis player. Like you cannot beat him. He goes this way. But it's tough to find one word. I would say like one adjective to describe his game. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you honestly, I have one in mind, and if I end up doing the project, I will let you know early in the process. I guarantee you. But I think the key thing for me is, like I said, I didn't want to repeat the Federer book and the Rafa book, and I wouldn't want to repeat the Federer and the Rafa book with the Djokovic book. I got to find an idea that really carries me if I'm going to do it, because let's face it, I mean, these things, you wake up thinking about them, you go to sleep thinking about them, you spend a year or two of it with it in your head and your life after already having covered these guys for 20 years. And it's been a great ride for all of us on the outside looking in to be able to be part of this. But I know from experience now that you live these things pretty fully when you're in the creative process. So you need the good structure and the good idea that's going to carry you forward. And there's a lot of Novak in the Master, and as you read the book, there's a great deal of Novak in the Warrior, and there needs to be, because he's obviously a big part of of Federer's story and Nadal's story, and he's a fascinating character. He really is. He's got so much to him, as I'm sure you know. So it would be a rich thing, but not quite yet. See how it goes.
Yeah, and also he needs probably to have some, like, I mean, retirement plans. He's going to retire at some point, but I saw a post on Instagram, which might be usually lying, but it said like, oh, he wants to continue until the 2028 Olympics, which by the current state of affairs seems unrealistic, like that he would want to keep playing. But then these guys are they are something different than human, right? So you don't know really, but it does sound like a long stretch to wait that long.
As Paul Annacone said, I mean, they're not going to be necessarily winning week to week anymore, but you can never count anybody that great out in a given week, as Novak proved at the Olympics last year. And don't forget, he beat Alcaraz in the Australian Open just a couple of months ago. So
this is true. You can never count them out.
It wasn't Carlitos' best match by any means, but he did it. So Novak has much better tennis in him still. It's like he fell off a cliff, but he has to access it. And will he be happy only accessing it every once in a while? I don't know. And also there's a force of nature aspect to it as well, as when the younger guys hit new levels and new heights, can you go with them or not? Maybe not. So, Federer would have won quite a lot of French Opens if not for Rafa Nadal outlying and arriving and being something that nobody'd seen before.
I have one more final question, I realized. So what's your feeling now around, let's say these three are now retired. I mean, Novak's still around. We'll never count them out. What is your feeling around professional tennis, like right now, from now onwards, 10 years? What's your personal feeling? Is it like, are you very positive or are you a bit negative? Everything is fine here in this forum, but what's your feeling?
Well, tennis has been a source of joy and frustration for me as a reporter for so long, because it's not a maximizing, self-actualizing thing. They have had a lot of internal tensions that have hurt the sport and continue to, and you can see the lawsuits that are happening now and the infighting and the rivalries between the Slams and the Masters 1000s and the ATP, and Davis Cup isn't what it should be, but it still takes up the calendar. So there's a whole lot of lost energy, and I think Andrea Gaudenzi works for the ATP, but he said it very well. I mean, tennis is not punching at the right weight. It should be punching more than it is for what value that it brings and the stars that it creates. So that's not a good thing. And then you have, in my country, I don't know about Sweden or other parts of the world, but us, we have pickleball that's arriving and maybe not taking up a lot of the space in terms of TV and stars, but a huge amount of the recreational space and the court space and everything else. So I don't think tennis is invulnerable at all, and I think ultimately the issue of format will come into play, and whether best of five is really what is the best thing for the sport going forward on the men's side. Much as I love it, or maybe we'll go to a first week best of three at the majors, second week best of five. I think it's a beautiful thing, but I don't know. I hardly know anybody who watches any full best of five tennis matches, and even the finals. People kind of come in and out, so it may be an antiquated format, sadly, in some ways. So that's a big issue. But I think the ultimately most important thing is the characters and the play. And for me, Alcaraz is unbelievably watchable. You can't take your eyes off the television screen when he's playing and he's having a good day or even a bad day. He's just a spectacular talent. So he's the key to the castle for me. I think he's the one that they can build, even though he may not be the best player in the world. He is the best spectacle in the world. For tennis, he can make the easy shot look hard and also the hard shot look easy. So you can't manufacture that. It just is. And so he's a precious thing. And I think if he's in the mix, tennis will have a lot of appeal. And then you have the guys that are going to be building up around him. But it's no guarantee. As just watch this documentary on Netflix, you can see all the forces that are pulling at him. And Carlos has a sweetness to him and a kind of gregariousness to him that could be draining. And he plays at a very extreme level. And so his body will be subject to injury. You just know it will. So I just hope they can keep him intact and energized, because he's great for the game.
I 100% agree. I think that's a great note to end on. We're both Carlitos fans, as many are. When I travel around, I was in Rotterdam earlier, and you go to the practice courts. Where do all the people end up? the Carlitos practice court is packed, like all Roger days or Rafa days. So we might be in good hands, hopefully. Fingers crossed. Thanks a lot,
Hey,
Chris. I took about
real
more
quick
time
though,
than I
real
should.
quick.
Yeah,
Last question for you. Last time
yeah,
we did this, I asked you a question at the end. I
yeah,
want to
for
ask
sure.
you even more. There is the theory that no babolats, no modern technology, no Rafa. What do you say to that?
That is a
With the
good
racket
theory.
monster.
That's like a good
With the
question.
strings too. The strings. Yeah.
I think no string, no Rafa for sure. I mean, although you had Bruguera, he played with amazing spin. I think that was also in your book a bit. You know, it's like you could play with a roll spin, you can get the pace, right? So with Rafa's ball and the way he played, you know, I mean, Rafa might make it work. Like on a tangent note, I would love a tournament, just a fun tournament. You put 10 players, top 10 guys, and they have to switch rackets every match. So the other guy has to give him, they switch rackets every match.
Mm.
And back in those days, it would have been fascinating to watch Federer hand his 90 square inch old school Wilson Pro staff to Rafa, and Rafa give his very powerful, very spin oriented pure arrow or Aero Pro drive as it was then to Roger. What would have happened? Like that would have been a spectacle, even if it's just a tiebreak to 10, which would have been tiebreak 10's format kind of. So yeah, maybe not. It's hard to say. I mean, like his mentor and coach Carlos Moya, he used a soft drive, like a version of the pure drive with insane specifications, all the weight in the handle, super light, but the weight, like you couldn't balance the racket on your finger, just falls off. So it's like the racket is such a strong part of the person, so it's kind of tough to think like that. But I think Rafa will find a way. He's a force of nature. So let's end on that
Mm.
note. But the racket is important in his history.
Now that's a good place to finish.
Yeah, I would say that's amazing. Good question, man. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Can talk tennis with you for hours. Of course, it's a passion we both have, and best of luck with the book. We'll publish a review on Tennis Nerd later on when it's out. And what, yeah, very more important information is when is the book out to be able to purchase or pre-order?
So it's out May 13th in North America, in English, Canada, and the US, and Australia as well. And it's out May 15th in the UK, and it's coming out in a bunch of languages in May as well. In German, it's coming out in Polish. It's coming out, I think, in Hungarian as well at that time. And then there are other editions. Spanish is also coming out, I think, quite quickly. And then you have other editions in French and other languages coming later. But the big push is May 13th and May 15th, and you'll be able to order it in English then. And the audio book's coming out as well, fully narrated that week as well. So you'll be able to pick up the audio book.
Are you narrating the audiobook?
I was told I was welcome to try, and it's just a much harder job than we imagined. Talking to you for an hour and a half, I guess, is all pure pleasure, but having to narrate a book as long as that one, they say people often lose their voices and lose their will to live after a while. So I'm leaving it to the professionals.
Yeah, I always thought that interesting, like the audio book part, because you like when you're talking for a long time, of course you're getting tired, and you have to phrase the right sentences the right way, and it's writing a book is one thing, reading a book is out loud is another thing. And then a lot of authors I've talked to, they really like stay away from narration, right? They're like it's horrible. But then I kind of like listening to books from the author. But then if the author has an annoying voice, then it's better to have a professional voice actor actually do it. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting topic.
They said it would take about 8 to 10 days to narrate a book of that length. That's a lot of time too on task in the studio. But
And yeah, you get
all I
tired.
can say is if people aren't tired of my voice by now, and they probably are, I do once in a while, I'll do some narration on my Substack, and I do narrate some of my articles because I do enjoy it. And I grew up, learning poems in school back when people did that, and narrating stuff like that. So, and reading aloud in school. So I've always thought that was a cool thing.
All right, thanks, Chris. Best of luck, and we keep in touch. I hope to see you in Paris if you're there. I hope I'm there on the 25th as well. It's going to be pretty packed if they do the Rafa thing on the 25th. But I might see you around. I hope to go to maybe Paris twice because I have some brands I work with there, so it will be cool.
Well, you know how to reach me, and I thank you very much for your great questions and your forum here. And I wish the best to all tennis nerds.
And go out and buy his book for sure.
Thanks, guys. Thank you so much, Jonas.
Thank you.